But the effectiveness of this apparently so efficient method has its limits. Of course, the presence of a surplus population, which it can hire cheaply in the labor market, is a necessity for the development of capitalism. But though too large a reserve army may in certain cases favor its quantitative expansion, it checks its qualitative development, especially the transition to types of enterprises which make more intensive use of labor. Low wages are by no means identical with cheap labor. From a purely quantitative point of view, the efficiency of labor decreases with a wage which is physiologically insufficient, which may in the long run even mean a survival of the unfit. The present-day average Silesian mows, when he exerts himself to the full, little more than 2/3 as much land as the better-paid and nourished Pomeranian or Mecklenburger, and the Pole, the further east he comes from, accomplishes progressively less than the German. God. Okay. I don't know.
What are you saying there, buddy?
It just feels a little bit much. Okay. Low wages fail, even from a purely business point of view, wherever it is a question of producing goods, which require any sort of skilled labor, or the use of expensive machinery, which is easily damaged, or in general, wherever any great amount of sharp attention or of initiative is required. Here low wages do not pay, and their effect is the opposite of what was intended. For not only is a developed sense of responsibility absolutely indispensable, but in general also an attitude which, at least during working hours, is freed from continual calculations of how the customary wage may be earned with a maximum of comfort and a minimum of exertion. Labor must, on the contrary, be performed as if it were an absolute end in itself, a calling. But such an attitude is by no means a product of nature. It cannot be evoked by low wages or high ones. Oh my God, I hate the dishwasher. I don't need you to beep. It's not like I'm like clanging to go put more dishes in, and so I therefore need you to beep every interval. Okay.
To be updated immediately.
I'm gonna drop everything and do dishes in the spirit of capitalism. I need to increase my efficiency. Okay. But such an attitude is by no means a product of nature. It cannot be evoked by low wages or high ones alone, but can only be the product of a long and arduous process of education. Today, capitalism, once in the saddle, can recruit its laboring force in all industrial countries with comparative ease. In the past, this was in every case an extremely difficult problem. And even today, it could probably not get along without the support of a powerful ally along the way, which, as we shall see below, was at hand at the time of its development. What is meant can again best be explained by means of an example. The type of backward traditional form of labor is today very often exemplified by women workers, especially unmarried ones. An almost universal complaint of employers of girls, for instance, German girls. This is just going in a direction that I kind of want to bring up. Caliban and the Witch, yeah. Okay, an almost universal complaint of employers of girls, for instance, German girls, is that they are almost entirely unable and unwilling to give up methods of work inherited or once learned in favor of more efficient ones, to adapt themselves to new methods, to learn and to concentrate their intelligence, or even to use it at all. Ah!
What? What did you just say?
I know.
A universal complaint?
Universal, dude. It's universal complaint, specifically of German girls. Explanations of the possibility of making work easier, above all, more profitable to themselves, generally encounter a complete lack of understanding. Increases of piece rates are without avail against the stone wall of habit. In general, it is otherwise, and that is a point of no little importance from our viewpoint, only with girls having a specifically religious, especially a pietistic background. A pietistic? Wouldn't you just say pious background?
Yeah.
Only with girls having a specifically religious, especially a pietistic background. One often hears, and statistical investigation confirms it. I might look up this citation
that, yeah.
18. Yeah, let's... 15. Okay, sorry, this is the end note. It says, see my zur Psychophysique de... I can only use a French accent. Joer Blicken Arbeit.
Joyer Blicken Ardit.
Yeah, so he must have written a book.
Is it Arbeit?
Arbeit?
Arbeito.
But it's not in French. Oh, you mean it's work.
That's where
So
it's
it's
from.
work. Okay. Arbeito. Mm-hmm. So it's his own work. He's citing his own work. His own statistical investigation confirms it.
Okay.
That by far the best chances of economic education are found among this group. The ability of mental concentration, as well as the absolutely essential feeling of obligation to one's job, are here most often combined with a strict economy which calculates the possibility of high earnings and a cool self-control and frugality which enormously increases performance. This provides the most favorable foundation for the conception of labor as an end in itself, as a calling which is necessary to capitalism. The chances of overcoming traditionalism are greatest on account of the religious upbringing. This observation of present-day capitalism in itself suggests that it is worthwhile to ask how this connection of adaptability to capitalism with religious factors may have come about in the days of the early development of capitalism. For that they were even then present in much the same form can be inferred from numerous facts. Okay, let's lay it down for me, Max. What are the facts? For instance, the dislike and the persecution which Methodist workmen in the 18th century met at the hands of their comrades were not solely or even principally the result of their religious eccentricities. England had seen many of those and more striking ones. It rested rather as a destruction of their tools, repeatedly mentioned in the reports, suggests upon their specific willingness to work, as we should say, today. However, let us again return to the present, and this time to the entrepreneur, in order to clarify the meaning of traditionalism in his case. Sombart, in his discussions of the genesis of capitalism, has distinguished between the satisfaction of needs and acquisition as the two great leading principles in economic history. In the former case, attainment of the goods necessary to meet personal needs, in the latter, a struggle for profit free from the limits set by needs, have been the ends controlling the form and direction of economic activity. What he calls the economy of needs seems at first glance to be identical with what is here described as economic traditionalism. That may be the case if the concept of needs is limited to traditional needs, but if that is not done, a number of economic types, which must be considered capitalistic according to the definition of capital, which Sombart gives in another part of his work, would be excluded from the category of acquisitive economy and put into that of needs economy. Enterprises, namely, which are carried on by private entrepreneurs by utilizing capital, parentheses, money or goods with a money value, end parentheses, to make a profit, purchasing the means of production and selling the product, i.e., undoubted capitalistic enterprises, may at the same time have a traditionalistic character. This has, in the course even of modern economic history, not been merely an occasional case, but rather the rule, with continual interruptions from repeated and increasingly powerful conquests of the capitalistic spirit. To be sure, the capitalistic form of an enterprise and the spirit in which it is run generally stand in some sort of adequate relationship to each other, but not in one of necessary interdependence. Nevertheless, we provisionally use the expression spirit of parentheses, modern and parentheses, capitalism to describe that attitude which seeks profit rationally and systematically in the manner which we have illustrated by the example of Benjamin Franklin. This, however, is justified by the historical fact that the attitude of mind has, on the one hand, found its most suitable expression in capitalistic enterprise, while, on the other, the enterprise has derived its most suitable motive force from the spirit of capitalism. But the two may very well occur separately. Benjamin Franklin was filled with the spirit of capitalism at a time when his printing business did not differ in form from any handicraft enterprise. And we shall see that at the beginning of modern times, it was by no means the capitalistic entrepreneurs of the commercial aristocracy who were either the sole or the predominant bearers of the attitude we have here called the spirit of capitalism. It was much more the rising strata of the lower industrial middle classes. Even in the 19th century, its classical representatives were not the elegant gentlemen of Liverpool and Hamburg, with their commercial fortunes handed down for generations, but the self-made parvenus of Manchester and Westphalia, who often rose from very modest circumstances. As early as the 16th century, the situation was similar. The industries which arose at that time were mostly created by parvenus. The management, for instance, of a bank, a wholesale export business, a large retail establishment, or of a large putting-out enterprise dealing with goods produced in homes, is certainly not possible in the form of a capitalistic enterprise. Nevertheless, they may all be carried on in a traditionalistic spirit. In fact, the business of a large bank of issue cannot be carried on in any other way. The foreign trade of whole epochs has rested on the basis of monopolies and legal privileges of strictly traditional character. In retail trade, and we are not here talking of the small men without capital who are continually crying out for government aid.
What? What did you just say, buddy?
The revolution which is making an end of the old traditionalism is still in full swing. It is the same development which broke up the old putting-out system, to which modern domestic labor is related only in form. How this revolution takes place and what is its significance may, in spite of the fact these things are so familiar, be again brought out by a concrete example. Until about the middle of the past century, the life of a putter-out was, at least in many of the branches of the continental textile industry, what we should today consider very comfortable. We may imagine its routine somewhat as follows. The peasants came with their cloth, often (in the case of linen) principally or entirely made from raw material which the peasant himself had produced, to the town in which the putter-out lived, and after a careful, often official, appraisal of the quality, received the customary price for it. The putter-out's customers, for markets any appreciable distance away, were middlemen, who also came to him, generally not yet following samples, but seeking traditional qualities, and bought from his warehouse, or, long before delivery, placed orders which were probably in turn passed on to the peasants. Personal canvassing of customers took place, if at all, only at long intervals. Otherwise correspondence sufficed, though the sending of samples slowly gained ground. The number of business hours was very moderate, perhaps 5 to 6 a day, sometimes considerably less, in the rush season, where there was one, more. Earnings were moderate enough to lead a respectable life, and in good times to put away a little. On the whole, relations among competitors were relatively good, with a large degree of agreement on the fundamentals of business. A long daily visit to the tavern, with often plenty to drink and congenial circle of friends, made life comfortable and leisurely. The form of organization was in every respect capitalistic. The entrepreneur's activity was of a purely business character. The use of capital turned over in the business was indispensable. And finally, the objective aspect of the economic process, the bookkeeping, was rational. But it was traditionalistic business. If one considers the spirit which animated the entrepreneur, the traditional manner of life, the traditional rate of profit, the traditional amount of work, the traditional manner of regulating the relationships with labor, and the essentially traditional circle of customers and the manner of attracting new ones, all these dominated the conduct of the business, were at the basis, one may say, of the ethos of this group of businessmen. You may say, not one may say. Now, at some time this leisureliness was suddenly destroyed, and often entirely without any essential change in the form of organization, such as a transition to a unified factory, to mechanical weaving, etc. What happened was, on the contrary, often no more than this. Some young man from one of the putting-out families went out into the country, carefully chose weavers for his employ, greatly increased the rigor of his supervision of their work, and thus turned them from peasants into laborers. On the other hand, he would begin to change his marketing methods by so far as possible going directly to the final consumer, would take the details into his own hands, would personally solicit customers, visiting them every year, and above all would adapt the quality of the product directly to their needs and wishes. At the same time, he began to introduce the principle of low prices and large turnover. There was repeated what everywhere and always is the result of such a process of rationalization. Those who would not follow suit had to go out of business. The idyllic state collapsed under the pressure of a bitter competitive struggle. Respectable fortunes were made, and not lent out at interest, but always reinvested in the business. The old leisurely and comfortable attitude toward life gave way to a hard frugality, in which some participated and came to the top, because they did not wish to consume but to earn, while others who wished to keep on with the old ways were forced to curtail their consumption. And, what is more important in this connection, it was not generally in such cases a stream of new money invested in the industry which brought about this revolution. In several cases known to me, the whole revolutionary process was set in motion with a few thousands of capital borrowed from relations. But the new spirit, the spirit of modern capitalism, had set to work. The question of the motive forces in the expansion of modern capitalism is not in the first instance a question of the origin of the capital sums which were available for capitalistic uses, but, above all, of the development of the spirit of capitalism. Where it appears and is able to work itself out, it produces its own capital and monetary supplies as the means to its ends. But the reverse is not true. Its entry on the scene was not generally peaceful. A flood of mistrust, sometimes of hatred, above all of moral indignation, regularly opposed itself to the first innovator. Often, I know of several cases of the sort, of which he will not mention, by the way. Regular legends of mysterious shady spots in his previous life have been produced. It is very easy not to recognize that only an unusually strong character could save an entrepreneur of this new type from the loss of his temperate self-control and from both moral and economic shipwreck. Furthermore, along with clarity of vision and ability to act, it is only by virtue of very definite and highly developed ethical qualities that it has been possible for him to command the absolutely indispensable confidence of his customers and workmen. Nothing else could have given him the strength to overcome the innumerable So they have to be a charismatic character, basically. Nothing else could have given him the strength to overcome the innumerable obstacles, above all, the infinitely more intensive work which is demanded of the modern entrepreneur. But these are ethical qualities of quite a different sort from those adapted to the traditionalism of the past. And as a rule, it has been neither daredevil and unscrupulous speculators, economic adventurers such as we meet at all periods of economic history, nor simply great financiers who have carried through this change. Outwardly so inconspicuous, but nevertheless so decisive for the penetration of economic life with the new spirit. On the contrary, they were men who had grown up in the hard school of life, calculating and daring at the same time, above all, temperate and reliable, shrewd and completely devoted to their business, with strictly bourgeois opinions and principles. One is tempted to think that these personal moral qualities have not the slightest relation to any ethical maxims, to say nothing of religious ideas, but that the essential relation between them is negative. The ability to free oneself from the common tradition, a sort of liberal enlightenment, seems likely to be the most suitable basis for such a business man's success. And today, that is generally precisely the case. Any relationship between religious beliefs and conduct is generally absent, and where any exists, at least in Germany, it tends to be of the negative sort. The people filled with the spirit of capitalism today tend to be indifferent, if not hostile, to the church. The thought of the pious boredom of paradise has little attraction for their active natures. Religion appears to them as a means of drawing people away from labor in this world. If you ask them what is the meaning of their restless activity, why they are never satisfied with what they have, thus appearing so senseless to any purely worldly view of life, they would perhaps give the answer, if they know any at all, quote, to provide for my children and grandchildren, end quote. But more often, and since that motive is not peculiar to them, but was just as effective for the traditionalists, more correctly, simply, that business, with its continuous work, has become a necessary part of their lives. That is, in fact, the only possible motivation. but it at the same time expresses what is, seen from the viewpoint of personal happiness, so irrational about this sort of life, where a man exists for the sake of his business instead of the reverse. Of course, the desire for the power and recognition which the mere fact of wealth brings plays its part. When the imagination of a whole people has once been turned toward purely quantitative bigness, as in the United States, this romanticism of numbers exercises an irresistible appeal to the poets among businessmen. Otherwise, it is in general not the real leaders, and especially not the permanently successful entrepreneurs, who are taken in by it. In particular, the resort to entailed estates and the nobility, with sons whose conduct at the university and in the offices corps tries to cover up their social origin, as has been the typical history of German capitalistic parvenu families, is a product of later decadence. The ideal type of the capitalistic entrepreneur, as it has been represented even in Germany by occasional outstanding examples, has no relation to such more or less refined climbers. He avoids ostentation and unnecessary expenditure, as well as conscious enjoyment of his power, and is embarrassed by the outward signs of the social recognition which he receives. His manner of life is, in other words, often, and we shall have to investigate the historical significance of just this important fact, distinguished by a certain ascetic tendency, as appears clearly enough in the sermon of Franklin, which we have quoted. It is, namely, by no means exceptional, but rather the rule, for him to have a sort of modesty which is essentially more honest than the reserve which Franklin so shrewdly recommends. He gets nothing out of his wealth for himself, except the irrational sense of having done his job well. But it is just that which seems to the pre-capitalistic man so incomprehensible and mysterious, so unworthy and contemptible, that anyone should be able to make it the sole purpose of his life work to sink into the grave weighed down with a great material load of money and goods, seems to him explicable only as the product of a perverse instinct, the ori sacra fams. At present, under our individualistic political, legal, and economic institutions, with the forms of organization and general structure which are peculiar to our economic order, this spirit of capitalism might be understandable, as has been said, purely as a result of adaptation. The capitalistic system so needs this devotion to the calling of making money. It is an attitude toward material goods which is so well suited to that system, so intimately bound up with the conditions of survival and the economic struggle for existence, that there can today no longer be any question of a necessary connection of the acquisitive manner of life with any single Weltanschauung. In fact, it no longer needs the support of any religious forces, and feels the attempts of religion to influence economic life, insofar as they can still be felt at all, to be as much an unjustified interference as its regulation by the state. In such circumstances, men's commercial and social interests do tend to determine their opinions and attitudes. Whoever does not adapt to this manner of life, to the conditions of capitalistic success, must go under, or at least cannot rise. But these are phenomena of a time in which modern capitalism has become dominant and has become emancipated from its old supports. But as it could at one time destroy the old forms of medieval regulation of economic life only in alliance with the growing power of the modern state, the same, we may say provisionally, may have been the case in its relation with religious forces. Whether and in what sense that was the case, it is our task to investigate. For that the conception of money making as an end in itself to which people are bound as a calling was contrary to the ethical feelings of whole epochs, it is hardly necessary to prove. The dogma Dio placer vix potest, which was incorporated into the canon law and applied to the activities of the merchant, and which at that time, parentheses, like the passage in the Gospel about interest, and parentheses, was considered genuine, as well as St. Thomas's characterization of the desire for gain as turpitudo, parentheses, which term even included unavoidable and hence ethically justified profit-making, and parentheses, already contained a high degree of concession on the part of the Catholic doctrine to the financial powers with which the church had some intimate political relations in the Italian cities, as compared with the much more radically anti-crematistic views of comparatively wide circles. But even where the doctrine was still more accommodated to the facts, as, for instance, with Anthony of Florence, the feeling was never quite overcome that activity directed to the acquisition for its own sake was at bottom a pudendum, which was to be tolerated only because of the unalterable necessities of life in this world. Some moralists of that time, especially of the nominalistic school, accepted developed capitalistic business forms as inevitable and attempted to justify them, especially commerce, as necessary. The industria developed in it were able to regard, though not without contradictions, as a legitimate source of profit and hence ethically unobjectionable. But the dominant doctrine rejected the spirit of capitalistic acquisition as turpitudo, or at least could not give it a positive ethical sanction. An ethical attitude like that of Benjamin Franklin would have been simply unthinkable. This was, above all, the attitude of capitalistic circles themselves. Their life work was, so long as they clung to the tradition of the church, at best something morally indifferent. It was tolerated, but was still, even if only on account of its continual danger of collision with the church's doctrine on usury, somewhat dangerous to salvation. Quite considerable sums, as the sources show, went at the death of a rich people to religious institutions as conscience money, at times even back to former debtors as usura, which had been unjustly taken from them. It was otherwise, along with heretical and other tendencies, looked upon with disapproval only in those parts of the commercial aristocracy which were already emancipated from the tradition. But even skeptics and people indifferent to the church often reconciled themselves with it by gifts, because it was a sort of insurance against the uncertainties of what might come after death, or because, at least according to the very widely held latter view, an external obedience to the commands of the church was sufficient to ensure salvation. Here, the either non-moral or immoral character of their action, in the opinion of the participants themselves, comes clearly to light. Now, how could activity, which was at best ethically tolerated, turn into a calling in the sense of Benjamin Franklin? The fact to be explained historically is that in the most highly capitalistic center of that time, in Florence of the 14th and 15th centuries, the money and capital market of all the great political powers, this attitude was considered ethically unjustifiable, or at best to be tolerated. But in the backwoods, small bourgeois circumstances of Pennsylvania in the 18th century, where business threatened for simple lack of money to fall back into barter, where there was hardly a sign of large enterprise, where only the earliest beginnings of banking were to be found, the same thing was considered the essence of moral conduct, even commanded in the name of duty. To speak here of a reflection of material conditions in the ideal superstructure would be patent nonsense. What was the background of idea which could account for the sort of activity apparently directed toward profit alone as a calling toward which the individual feels himself to have an ethical obligation? For it was this idea which gave the way of life of the new entrepreneur its ethical foundation and justification. The attempt has been made, particularly by Sombart, in what are often judicious and effective observations, to depict economic rationalism as a salient feature of modern economic life as a whole, undoubtedly with justification, if by that is meant the extension of the productivity of labor which has, through the subordination of the process of production to scientific points of view, relieved it from the dependence upon the natural organic limitations of the human individual. Now, this process of rationalization in the field of technique and economic organization undoubtedly determines an important part of the ideals of life of modern bourgeois society. Labor in the service of a rational organization for the provision of humanity with material goods has without doubt always appeared to representatives of the capitalistic spirit as one of the most important purposes of their life work. It is only necessary, for instance, to read Franklin's account of his efforts in the service of civic improvements in Philadelphia clearly to apprehend his obvious truth. and the joy and pride of having given employment to numerous people, of having had a part in the economic progress of his hometown, in the sense referring to figures of population and volume of trade, which capitalism associated with the word. All these things obviously are part of the specific and undoubtedly idealistic satisfactions in life to modern men of business. Similarly, it is one of the fundamental characteristics of an individualistic capitalistic economy that it is rationalized on the basis of rigorous calculation, directed with foresight and caution toward the economic success which is sought in sharp contrast to the hand-to-mouth existence of the peasant and to the privileged traditionalism of the guild craftsman and of the adventurer's capitalism, oriented to the exploitation of political opportunities and irrational speculation. It might thus seem that the development of the spirit of capitalism is best understood as part of the development of rationalism as a whole, and could be deduced from the fundamental position of rationalism on the basic problems of life. In the process, Protestantism would only have to be considered insofar as it had formed a stage prior to the development of a purely rationalistic philosophy. But any serious attempt to carry this thesis through makes it evident that such a simple way of putting the question will not work, simply because of the fact that the history of rationalism shows a development which by no means follows parallel lines in the various departments of life. The rationalization of private law, for instance, if it is thought of as a logical simplification and rearrangement of the content of the law, was achieved in the highest hitherto known degree in the Roman law of late antiquity, but it remained most backward in some of the countries with the highest degree of economic rationalization, notably in England, where the renaissance of Roman law was overcome by the power of the great legal corporations, while it has always retained its supremacy in the Catholic countries of Southern Europe. The worldly rational philosophy of the 18th century did not find favor alone or even principally in the countries of highest capitalistic development. The doctrines of Voltaire are even today the common property of broad, upper, and what is practically more important, middle-class groups in the Romance Catholic countries. Finally, if under practical rationalism is understood the type of attitude which sees and judges the world consciously in terms of the worldly interests of the individual ego, then this view of life was and is the special peculiarity of the peoples of the Liberum Arboretum, such as the Italians and the French are in very flesh and blood. But we have already convinced ourselves that this is by no means the soil in which that relationship of a man to his calling as a task, which is necessary to capitalism, has preeminently grown. In fact, one may, this simple proposition, which is often forgotten, should be placed at the beginning of every study which essays to deal with rationalism. Rationalize life from fundamentally different basic points of view and in very different directions. Rationalism is an historical concept which covers a whole world of different things. It will be our task to find out whose intellectual child the particular concrete form of rational thought was, from which the idea of a calling and the devotion to labor in the calling has grown, which is, as we have seen, from the standpoint of purely eudaimonistic self-interest, but which has been and still is one of the most characteristic elements of our capitalistic culture. We are here particularly interested in the origin of precisely the irrational element which lies in this, as in every conception of a calling.